In the small village of Greenfield, there was a big, old house at the end of Willow Lane. Everyone called it the Oakwood House because it was surrounded by tall oak trees. The house was over 100 years old, and it had a secret. The Oakwood House belonged to an old man named Mr. Thomas. He lived alone with his cat, Whiskers. Mr. Thomas was very old, and he loved clocks. His house was filled with clocks of all shapes and sizes. There were grandfather clocks, wall clocks, table clocks, and even a small clock on his keychain. But the most special clock was an old, dusty grandfather clock that stood in the corner of his living room. The grandfather clock was very tall and made of dark wood. Its hands were golden, and it had a big, round face with numbers in black. It had a long pendulum that swung back and forth, ticking softly. But there was something strange about this clock. It always showed a different time than all the other clocks in the house. No matter how much Mr. Thomas tried to fix it, it always went back to its own time. One sunny morning, Mr. Thomas was sitting in his rocking chair, reading a book. Whiskers was curled up on his lap, purring softly. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Mr. Thomas got up slowly, put on his slippers, and walked to the door. When he opened the door, he saw two children standing there. They were his neighbors, Emily and Jack. Emily was 10 years old, and Jack was 8. They loved visiting Mr. Thomas because he always had interesting stories to tell. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas," Emily said with a big smile. "Can we come in and see your clocks?" "Of course, children," Mr. Thomas replied with a warm smile. "Come in, come in." Emily and Jack entered the house, their eyes wide with wonder. They always felt like they were stepping into a different world when they entered Mr. Thomas's house. The ticking of the clocks was like music to their ears. As they walked around, looking at the different clocks, Emily noticed the old grandfather clock in the corner. She had seen it many times before, but today it seemed different. She walked up to it and looked at the time. The clock showed 3:15, but all the other clocks in the house showed 10 o'clock. "Mr. Thomas, why is this clock different from the others?" Emily asked, pointing at the grandfather clock. Mr. Thomas walked over and looked at the clock. He sighed and said, "Ah, that is a very special clock, my dear. It has a secret that I have not been able to discover in all my years." "A secret?" Jack said, his eyes lighting up. "What kind of secret?" Mr. Thomas sat down in his rocking chair and motioned for the children to sit down. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "A long time ago, when I was a young man, I bought this clock from an old shop in the city. The shopkeeper told me that this clock was very special and that it held a secret. But he did not tell me what the secret was. He only said that one day, I would discover it on my own." The children listened with wide eyes, their imaginations running wild. "Over the years, I have tried many times to discover the secret of this clock," Mr. Thomas continued. "I have taken it apart and put it back together, but I have never found anything unusual. It always goes back to showing a different time. I believe that this clock is waiting for the right person to discover its secret." Emily and Jack looked at each other with excitement. They loved mysteries, and this was the biggest mystery they had ever heard of. "Can we try to discover the secret, Mr. Thomas?" Emily asked eagerly. Mr. Thomas smiled and nodded. Of course, my dear. You are welcome to try. But remember, it may not be easy. The children spent the rest of the day examining the clock. They looked at every detail, touched every part, and listened to the ticking sound. But they found nothing unusual. As the sun began to set, Mr. Thomas told the children that it was time to go home. You can come back tomorrow if you like, he said. Maybe you will have better luck then. The children thanked Mr. Thomas and promised to come back the next day. As they walked home, they talked excitedly about the clock and what its secret might be. That night, Emily could not sleep. She kept thinking about the clock and its secret. She decided to do some research. She went to the old library in the village and looked for books about clocks and their secrets. She found a dusty old book called The Mysteries of Time and took it home. The next morning, Emily and Jack went back to Mr. Thomas's house with the book. They showed it to Mr. Thomas, and he was very interested. This book might have some answers, Mr. Thomas said. Let's read it together. They spent the whole day reading the book. It was filled with stories about magical clocks and their secrets. But there was one story that caught their attention. It was about a grandfather clock that showed a different time because it was connected to a hidden room. The room could only be found at the time shown on the clock. This is it, Jack exclaimed. Maybe the old clock is showing us the time to find the hidden room. Mr. Thomas looked at the clock. It was showing 3:15 again. If this story is true, then we need to look for the hidden room at 3:15. The children waited eagerly for the time to come. When the clock showed 3:15, they started looking around the house for any signs of a hidden room. They knocked on the walls, looked behind the furniture, and checked every corner. Suddenly, Whiskers, the cat, started meowing loudly. He was standing in front of a bookshelf in the living room. Emily noticed that one of the books on the shelf looked different from the others. She pulled the book, and to everyone's surprise, the bookshelf moved to reveal a hidden door. They opened the door and found a small, dusty room. Inside the room was a chest. Mr. Thomas opened the chest and found old letters, photos, and a beautiful gold watch. These are my grandfather's things, Mr. Thomas said with tears in his eyes. I have been looking for these for so many years. The children were overjoyed. They had discovered the secret of the old clock and helped Mr. Thomas find his grandfather's treasures. From that day on, the old clock no longer showed a different time. It ticked in harmony with all the other clocks in the house. Mr. Thomas thanked Emily and Jack for their help and told them that they were always welcome in his home. The mystery of the old clock brought the village closer together. Everyone loved to hear the story of how two brave children discovered the secret of the Oakwood house. And Mr. Thomas, Emily, and Jack became the best of friends, always looking for new adventures and mysteries to solve.